Our speaker this afternoon is Jan Makowski. She spent a lot of time in the 80s and the 90s researching the locations of private cemeteries in Scarborough and documenting the information that's on the stones. So I'm looking forward to your presentation, Jan. And at this point, I'll turn it over to you. Want the lights up at this point?
Yeah.
Leave them up for now?
Yeah. First of all, it's been a while since I've been to these cemeteries, so I'm kind of reacquainting myself, or ask what's there. We're talking about over 20 years or more. And it's also been 6 years since I've been in front of a classroom, so I'm kind of rusty, so I need my notes. I know Rodney didn't look at any notes last week, but I need to look at notes. First of all, I'm a transplant from Massachusetts. I moved to Maine in the fall of '75 to begin a 37-year teaching career in high school math. 36 of those were at Greeley High School in Cumberland. And I have lived in Scarborough since 1981. Although I taught math, I've always been interested in local history. And so as I adopted Scarborough as my new hometown, I did take a few adult ed classes that were on the history of Scarborough. And it was at that time that I found out that there was a need to document the private cemeteries that were scattered throughout the town of Scarborough as new development was, I would say slowly, was quickly creeping into the town. Dorothy Shaw Libby is the one who laid the groundwork, and she began this in 1974, documenting the cemeteries. She had created a list of the names of the cemeteries, a description of the location as to where they could be found, and she had marked a Scarborough road map with the cemeteries. I have updated a road map, which is up there with the amount of cemeteries that she had found, and then some of the other ones that I have now found. And those are in red. Beginning in 1988 and continuing to around 1995, I kind of trekked through all the woods in Scarborough. I used my summer vacations, and I used Dorothy's information on those cemeteries. Now remember, I did not grow up in Scarborough, so when she tells, the description said, cemetery located on Beach Ridge Road, the old Mary Farm. I had no idea what the Mary Farm was. To me, that's Pearson's farm. So that was the sort of thing that I dealt with. She researched and compiled information for about 46 private cemeteries. So with the help of anyone who would come along with me, I know Anna came with me once, and Linda came with me, but anybody who was willing to come trekking through the woods with me, we went looking. A few of the cemeteries that I was directed to, we couldn't find them. Some of them were moved to either one of the town cemeteries. And some of the gravestones over the years had fallen, and therefore they were hidden underneath the litter, so we have no idea that there was a gravestone there. Some cemeteries had only one gravestone. The largest cemetery had 19 gravestones in it. Some had unmarked field stones marking the grave sites. The oldest dated stone that I found in a Scarborough private cemetery was from 1755. It was when that individual had died. It was on a crudely etched stone. The oldest professionally carved stone was from 1783. And the newest stone found that I found in a private cemetery was from 1926. Besides Dorothy's information, some tips came into the Historical Society as to where to find. Hunters would go out and they'd come across one. They said, did you know there's a cemetery here? Or people had grown up in Scarborough and would say, I remembered there was a cemetery so-and-so at a place. Or, as a result of new house sites being built, some cemeteries were now in plain view after enjoying years of quiet seclusion. During the time that I walked all over Scarborough, I visited and documented 61 cemeteries in Scarborough, and I found another 17 in neighboring towns that had Scarborough family connections, like in Saco, South Portland, Gorham. At each cemetery that I visited, I transcribed everything that was legible on every stone. I took photos of just about every gravestone. I drew a rough map of the location to let others know how to find it. But here we go, now it's been 20 years since I've done this, so the next person probably not know when I say a certain place where it's located. But just remember, if I say Pearson's Farm, it's still Pearson's Farm now. There's also a use of the GPS. The cemeteries have been mapped by the code enforcement, and Captain Marla St. Pierre of the Polk Police Department. I also sketched the cemetery's layout with the visible gravestones, to give an idea as to how the stones were arrayed and so forth. All these cemeteries and their information have been numbered, indexed, and placed in notebooks, of which Society has 2 copies. In 1997, I earned a master's degree in American and New England Studies at USM, and whenever I was assigned a paper to write, if I could, I used Scarborough, especially the cemeteries, as my topic, and the Society does have copies of those as well. So just keep in mind, the slides you're about to see of these cemeteries, this is how they looked 20 years ago. So now we'll probably shut the break off. And can I have the, you do that?
She is right behind you. Oh, that's okay. I get to watch this.
Okay. Turn on? Yep. That focus, okay. All right, so these first slides are examples of some unmarked and crudely cut gravestones, a lot of them just using field stones. Unfortunately, when you use the field stones, and after the families left the area, the stones began to look like ordinary stones, and then they were moved to become parts of foundations, doorsteps, and stone walls. This is behind Thurlow's at 114 Ash Swamp Road. This is near Dolly Cemetery. There are 6 unmarked field stones. They were situated around the perimeter of a rise, roughly southeast of where the Dolly gravestone cemetery happens to be. This one's found in the Reverend Stephen Waterhouse and Fogg Cemetery on Pearson's Farm on Beach Ridge Road, along the Berry Road. Here's an example of 2 unmarked field stones. This is said to be Charles Pine Cemetery. This is found on Gorham Road as you head to Gorham, or Brockton Road heading to Gorham, on the left, and just before the Nonsuch River. There are new houses in this development, this area, and I'm hoping that the cemetery, that stone is still there. And this stone does resemble the stone that is found in a photo of Pine's resting place in Bolton's Grandfather's Tales. So I'm pretty sure that this is it. There are some unknown stones, but just the way they're set up, definitely had to mark something. This is behind Fengler's off of Mitchell Hill Road. There's approximately 8 unmarked field stones neatly arranged. And somewhere I had possibly read that there was a community mentioned in some book about a Vine Street off of Holmes Road in Mitchell Hill. So it's possible that was a community that was there. And again, since we were there over 20 years ago, that area is completely developed, and so I'm curious as to if the stones are still there. Next to those stones, it almost looked like this is maybe where the stones were quarried. This is where they got the stones to use. You can see they look kind of flat. Be able to use those, put them in as gravestones. This is another one. This was located behind the house at 126 Broad Turn Road. There's some stones under a large pine tree. Bob Jones believed that these stones were marked as Indian burials, and his family was alarmed when a house was being built nearby. So this is the oldest dated stone. This is for Richard Carter. He was born in 1755. And he died in 1828. This is behind what was Fred Gainham's house. So again, if you're from here, you probably know what I'm talking about. This is a hand-carved stone, and sometimes the early stones were carved either by neighbors, friends, or families. And usually some were not wealthy enough to hire a carver to do this. I used chalk in a lot of them. It's said to highlight and easy to take a photo of. And chalk does come off with rain over time, so it doesn't do anything to the stone. This is another unmarked area. This is actually it's within the Shoup Johnson Cemetery, which is off of Huntley Drive. which is off of Broad Turn Road. This was found left of a sand pit on a knoll, and these unmarked stones were actually located within the cemetery, where they're also carved and dated gravestones. This slide shows you the evolution of gravestone design. In the beginning, the emphasis is on what's called a death's head or skull icon, and some people called it the light bulb with eyes. Gravestones were consisting of three main sections. It had the tympanum, which is where the icon is located. Then you had the main body of the gravestone, where you had your epitaph and the names of the people who were buried, and then you had borders. But again, as that tympanum evolved, as religious beliefs and society changed, and went from the popularity of the death's head, then it went to what was called the cherub, and then finally the willow tree and urn. From the 1600s to about the early 1700s, and rural areas kind of lagged behind. The skull or death head reflected decay, life's brevity. It was a graphic reminder of death and the presence of mortal remains. The death's head reflected the harsh Puritan attitudes when burial was strictly a civil, not religious ceremony. Epitaphs on these types of stones, or with this icon, usually began with "Here lies" or "Here lies buried." The skull or death's head represents the finality of death, or death of the body. And the epitaph for these often had some kind of derivation of the popular "stranger, stop and cast an eye," which is referred to as memento mori, which means in Latin, remember death, and it's reminding the onlooker of life's brevity. During the mid-1700s, judgment and mortality was de-emphasized, and life after death became stressed. In addition to the wings, as you can see up the line there, represents now the flight of the soul or the resurrection, which means life now lives on ever after. These are examples of death icons. You have your death's head, you have an hourglass, and crossed bones. This is not from Scarborough. This is from a grave site in Truro on Cape Cod, which is my favorite place to vacation. When I go on vacation, I tramp through all the cemeteries there too. This is also from Truro, Cape Cod, but this is an example of a winged death's head. And again, the winged skull symbolizes the flight of the soul for mortal man. There are many of this type of cemetery gravestone with again, that light bulb with eyes and the wings. And throughout New England, many of these are said to be contributed to someone called the Boston Carver. Now, this is Sarah Libby Cemetery. So you do have that light bulb with eyes, and you've got the wings. This is on Mitchell Hill Road, to the left of the Curry House on edge of the field. She was the first wife of Richard Libby. And again, she's got the wings, death head, or the wing skull. She died in 1797. I found in Charles Libby's manuscript, he states that Richard and his second wife were supposed to be buried here as well, and never found them. Nor have the present owners of the Currys, and I think they're like 5th or 6th generation family of Libby, and he says they had never seen that those stones either. This is my favorite site. I think I drove Mr. Curry crazy every time I was going up there looking at the stone one more time, getting more information. And I incorporated this site into 2 of my research papers. You can note the crispness of the letters. And there's a spot that looks like maybe the carver made an error and was trying to ground it out and then recarve. But it's a high quality slate. It has smooth finish on both sides. It's a thick piece of slate. It's got good color and lack of exfoliation. And I was told that the deeper the slate was quarried from, the longer that the slate was compressed, and therefore the slate would not start flaking apart. And this stone is the only 18th century stone of this kind of high quality that I found that was not in either Black Point or Dunstan Cemetery. But she's up there all by herself. This is a rubbing that I did of that gravestone. And a rubbing of her footstone. And both those rubbings are up on the table. The next group of slides shows the various types and styles of icons that were used. And we'll begin again with the death's head or death masks. This is from the Black Point Cemetery. This stone is related to Sarah's because this death's head is the gravestone of Sarah's father-in-law, who died, John, who died in 1756. So this is the second so-called skull that I found. Also in Black Point Cemetery, this is Sarah's sister-in-law. This is Jane, who died in 1766. So the two stones together are from the same family, Libby family. So I'm assuming that the family that Sarah married into had strong ties to this particular icon, and find it on, again, I found it on 3 of the gravestones that they're linked to. This is the Plummer Libby Cemetery. It's behind a house at 22 Westwood Road. This is of Samson Plummer, who died in 1783. And this is the earliest professional carved private burial ground that I found. And it's on his wife, Elizabeth, 1788. This is an example of a death mask. The stone that was used is probably what they call a water rock, or a schist-like rough surface stone. It looks a lot like the rock material that you find along the coast, like in Prout's Neck, Cape Elizabeth. And probably the wave action planed the top area that was exposed, so maybe easy to carve. The borders on this one happen to have vines, which represent the wine and blood of Christ. This is from the Burnham Cemetery. Now, when I went to find this the first time, it was off Broad Turn Road, off the Tibbetts Road, had to walk down a cart path. Now all I have to do is go to Joss Hill Estates, and it's down at the end on the right-hand side. But this is the gravestone of Mary Burnham. She was the first wife of Aaron. She died in 1787 in childbirth. And this is another death mask. And possibly the stone carver for this is the same as the previous Plummer Cemetery. This is Sally Burnham. This is Aaron's second wife, who died in 1795. This is at the Black Point Cemetery. This is an example of a gravestone that has 4 death masks. It's with Joseph Prout, who died in 1791, and 3 of his children. I'm thinking maybe the same carver of the previous ones. And you can also notice that there are vines and now grapes also visible in that border. Now the next icon that was shifted to is cherubs, and they kind of showed up around the mid-1700s to 1820s. There was the decline of Puritanism. This became a popular English design. It shifted from mortality to immortality, meaning only part of the deceased remains. The soul has gone to its eternal reward. The epitaph on these often now starts with, "Here lies the body of," from that, and goes to "in memory of." So this is from Dunstan Cemetery. This is the Fabian family gravestone with the cherubs, and you notice there's 1 original, and then they have 4 reproductions. Black Point Cemetery, Samuel Small Esquire's gravestone, an example of a winged cherub. And this one almost looks more face-like, and it's possible it's supposed to look like Small himself. Symbolizes the soul of the deceased. And on the back of the stone, there's another description. It's the only time I've ever seen a stone that had something on both sides of it. It's for Dorothy Hubbard, and it says she's the relict of Samuel, which is the old word for widow. And it's done so well you can actually see the carving lines as to what he did. And I have rubbings of that as well on the table. Also Black Point Cemetery, this is Solomon Larrabee's gravestone. another Wayne cherub, and again, possibly, maybe that's what he looked like. And I have a rubbing of that as well on the table. Now this is at the Dunstan Cemetery. It's not a cherub, but a little bit something different. This is William McLaughlin Cemetery, his gravestone. It's an example of a rising or a half sun icon. It's supposed to symbolize both the beginning and the end of life. Also symbolizes spiritual resurrection. And it's also like at the point of death, at the moment it transitions from this world to the next. The third most often used icon was the willow and urn. From the late 1700s, but mostly in the 1800s, this was found. It was found on slate stones, but it became more and more prominent on marble stones. The willow symbolizes nature's lament of sorrow and mourning. The urn is a Greek symbol of mourning, and the urn represents your mortality. It's what occupies the grave. The body is the vessel of the soul. The willow's popularity may have come about since one was planted beside Napoleon's tomb on the island of St. Helena in 1821. His remains were later returned to Paris in 1840. Willow branches were used to ward off spirits of the dead, and the willow became a symbol of mourning, and grave sites were now memorials to individuals. The epitaph on these often started with "in memory of" or "sacred to the memory of." And this one does have that, and this is for the Moulton Thomas Cemetery. That's on the old Fogg property on Broad Turn Road. This is Major Jonathan Moulton. He was a veteran of War of 1812. This is back to Burnham Cemetery. Now Aaron Burnham's gravestone, died 1820. He has an example of the weeping willow icon, but his epitaph that says, "Time was I, stood where thou dost now, and viewed the dead as they dost me. Ere long they'll be as low as I, and others stand and gaze at thee," which more is an example of that memento mori, and it's more suitable to be with a death mask or a death head than with the willow. This is back at the Chute Johnson Cemetery, which is off of Huntley Drive, off of Broad Turn. This is a gravestone of Samuel Chute. It has a fancy border. It's a thick slate. The death date on the stone says 1853, but records from the Rummery book says that he died in 1837. But sometimes it took months to years to erect a stone. It was dependent upon the availability of a carver, what he had in stock, and the time it was going to take him to individualize it and then finally get the stone erected. This rubbing is also on the table. This is from the Libby, Jones, Buggy, McKinney, Johnson Cemetery. This is off of Mussey Road on the old Nielsen farm. Gravestone of William Libby, who died in 1858. This site has a lot of destruction in it, even then. This is the Dunstan Cemetery, gravestone of Anna Boothby, who died in 1853. So this is an example of a slate gravestone, but it has a pair of willows. Back to Black Point. This is an example of a twin slate stone with willows for Dorothy and Daniel Libby. Back to Dunstan. So this is a marble gravestone with the willow, and these are the ones that you really begin to see later on through the 1800s. Dunstan Cemetery. This is a gravestone of Mary, who died in 1882. She was the wife of George Abbott. This is an example of finger pointed toward heaven, which means pointed toward the rewards of heaven. Sometimes it symbolized a sudden death. Here's another from Black Point Cemetery of Samuel Libby, who died in 1851. This is a map of the range as to where gravestones were shipped. Most of them came from the Boston area carvers. Before 1820, when Maine was part of Massachusetts, where many of the gravestones were carved in Boston and shipped to Maine, And also before 1820, stone carving was considered a second occupation. Most of those carvers were either mariners, blacksmiths, map makers, or surveyors. After 1820, carving became a full-time occupation, and with generations of carvers within one family. The John Stevens Shop in Newport, Rhode Island, which was founded in 1705, is one of the oldest continuously operating stone carving businesses in the United States. The Stevens family ran the shop till 1927, and then they sold the business to Benson family, and they are still producing hand-carved inscriptions in stone. Other grave stones that came to Maine were coming from Salem and parts of southeast Mass. Some carvers signed the gravestones. This is from the Fenderson, Joe's, Harmon, Sands, Fickett, Missouri Cemetery. The name's getting longer. This is on Route 22, opposite Deering's Farm. It was found down a dirt road left of a sand pit. This is the gravestone of Ivory Fenderson, who died in 1813. And at the bottom left of the gravestone, it shows the carver's initials of A.W. This is from the Reverend Stephen Waterhouse over on Pearson's Farm. At the bottom of the gravestone for Julia A.C. Waterhouse, it says that the name of the stone cutter was G.H. Cleves from Saco. Dunstan Cemetery, gravestone of Susan Libby. She died in 1862 at age 25. Stone cutter's name is down at the bottom right, and it says H. Hansen. Epitaphs. This is a drawing depiction of a kind of a funny memento mori. I think she needs something. In a book from a Massachusetts cemetery, I also found this epitaph. The light of my life has gone out, and added the following year, I've struck another match. Dunstan Cemetery, this is a gravestone of Lydia Bond, and this is another version of the memento mori. This is a very common version, as you are now, so once was I, as I am now, you soon must be. Back to the Fenderson, Joe's, Harmon, Sands, Fickett, Missouri. This is a gravestone of Zechariah Harmon. He happens to have an epitaph quote from the Bible, from the Psalm, 24th Psalm, or Psalm 24. This is back to the Moulton Thomas Cemetery, which is on the old Fog Farm on Broad Term. This is a gravestone of Margaret. She was the wife of that Major Jonathan Moulton. She also has a psalm epitaph that says, "Alas, she has left us, her spirit has fled. Her body now slumbers along with the dead. Her Savior hath called her, to him she has gone. Be you also ready to follow her soon." And Richard Jose on the Fenderson Joe's Harmon. His epitaph says, "Clouds and darkness was round about him. Righteousness and judgment are his habitation." So maybe the clouds and darkness around him, perhaps he was ill. Gravestones were bought in pairs. There was a headstone and a footstone, and this is because before cemeteries were organized, they wanted to avoid digging into another grave. And also it should be noted that it was common practice in the 17th and 18th centuries to bury the deceased facing east, since it was believed that on Judgment Day the dead would rise to face the sun on Resurrection Day. All the 18th century family gravestone sites that I visited are all arranged in this west-to-east alignment. In Black Point, some are aligned northwest to southeast. The majority face the road or west to east. In Dunstan, practically all are arranged southwest to northeast, perpendicular to the road. In addition, a wife was laid to rest to her husband's left, to face their Maker on Judgment Day, just as they faced the minister on their wedding day. By the way, so this is at the Stephen Waterhouse Farm. So this is an example of a marble footstone. but with no inscriptions on it. This is from that Moulton Thomas Cemetery. This is a marble footstone, but now it has initials MM, which was Margaret Moulton's. Back to Stephen Waterhouse Fogg Cemetery. This is an example of a slate footstone that's not only initialed but also dated, MW 1840. This was Moses Waterhouse. And Plummer and Libby, this is the one behind Westwood Road Residence on that water rock. Footstone has the name of Margaret Libby right on it, and there's some little decoration on it as well. Children were fortunate to live to adulthood. Here are examples of some that didn't make it. This is from the Thurston Cemetery that was once located, well, it was off of Broad Turn, but it was where the Gantner's Farm was. And it's now Woodfield Drive development. So as you enter the development, this is off to the left on the edge of woods. Benjamin died at 1 year, 4 months, and Hannah died at 1 year, 3 months. Dunstan Cemetery. This is a gravestone of Ira Carter. 3 infant children. They were all named for the previous one who died. Some cemeteries had a lot of destruction. This used to be the A.I. Plummer Cemetery. This was on the Weber Farm in Lennox Neck. The cemetery has been completely destroyed. The day I went there, I spoke to Mr. Weber, and he said when the parents of the children were informed as to what their kids had done to the cemetery, their answer was, the kids, what are you going to do? Or something to that effect. But to me, eerily, it looks like a face in the hole. Oh, have you seen that?
Is that Millbrook?
No, it's further down before you. The road kind of goes up to the right. You guys know that area better than I do. What's the name of the road that takes you out to that point? Is it Libby Point? Yeah, to Plummer's Island. There's a road that takes you to Plummer's Island. This is off to the left, closer to. In the distance, you could actually see where the railroad tracks go. It's in that area.
Because there's a little tiny cemetery that I found in Milk Pond, and if I remember correctly, I think it had plumbers and Libby's in it.
Really? Well, let's see if I have it. If I don't, I need to talk to you. Here's another one. This was the Evan Libby Farm Cemetery behind Hillcrest Retirement Community off of Route 1. It's now accessible off the Eastern Trail. It was beyond what was a gravel pit. Again, cemetery destroyed. There's only one stone standing for David Wilbur, who died in 1793. I think that stone actually showed up. I was trying to get pictures of all the things that were all lying down. And his stone looks like there's a bullet hole through it. And I did bring the newspaper article from the Leader on this particular cemetery that happened to be in there, and that's on the table as well. Back to the Chute Johnson, and I sometimes call it Plummer Cemetery as well. This was a broken gravestone of Susan P. something. I thought maybe it said Plummer. The stone was unreadable. The rubbings didn't help me try to figure out what the names were. I even used pieces of foil and tucked them in the letters to see if we could get the name, and that didn't help. But I believe the last name was Plummer, and I think she was the wife of Eldridge Plummer, from what I could see from that gravestone. I spent hours at the Historical Society in Portland trying to find out. The only record I found was for a Susan Plummer, who died at the age of 21, and there was no other information. So I'm thinking her husband remarried and he's buried elsewhere, and that's why I couldn't find his stone here. This is one of many Libby cemeteries. This is off of Maple Avenue, up on a knoll. Development is now all around the cemetery, and basically the cemetery has been destroyed. This is what remains of Osgood Libby stone. This was from another Libby cemetery. These Libby stones were at the Scarborough Historical Society. They were saved from destruction when the Shaw supermarket at the intersection of Payne Road and Gorham Road were being built. 16 bodies were supposedly moved by the town to Dunstan Cemetery and reburied in one grave. I just don't know why they didn't take the stones with them. left them there. This is a gravestone of Amos, of the ones that they were at the Historical Society. Again, saved from the Shaw Supermarket site. So groupings, how some of the stones were laid out. This is the Plummer Libby Cemetery behind Westwood Road, a residence. So this is a Plummer Cemetery, Sandy Point Road, Winnick's Neck. Does that look like one or something different?
That might be it.
That might be
It
it.
was a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Again, I haven't been there for a while, so.
Yeah.
This is the Harmon Cemetery. This is at the intersection of Beech Ridge Road and Holmes. These stones were moved from their original setting at the rear of the lot and reset near the road. So this alters the historical status of this burial site. The stones are no longer grave markers, but memorial markers. Some sites were hidden. Yet another Libby Cemetery. This one's off of Beech Ridge Road. It was formerly on Nelson Harmon Reserve Farm, and that when I went, I had spoken to a Leroy Alquist. Recently, I noticed that it's a paved road now that gets into this, and CLK Lane Private has a sign there. It's a sign there. This is John and Anna's Libby stones, but they were completely covered and protected by vinca vines. This is the Hasty Mitchell Cemetery. It's on Spurwink Road, diagonally opposite Sawyer Road. Collins Cemetery, this is on Broad Turn Road on the right, before you get to the Burnham Road intersection. This market states that there's a vault containing Jonathan Collins and his wife Rebecca. It's on top of a steep, narrow hill. Jonathan served during the Revolutionary War, and I was told that Jonathan was confined to a wheelchair, and he was buried in that wheelchair in that vault. This is the Libby Jones Buggy McKinney Johnson Cemetery again, up on the Nielsen Farm off of Mussey Road. The cemetery is within a stand of trees. Behind that site is the business park off of Postal Service Way and Border Road, South Portland. Some students cleaned this cemetery. They bought some fencing, and they tried to organize what the remains were of that cemetery to make it look like somebody was aware that that was there. Gravestone of Ellen P., who was the wife of Elbridge. This is the destroyed gravestone and footstone of Julia Libby. And the gravestone of Elbridge Libby. This is entrance to Ottawa Woods in the Larrabee Cemetery, which is off of Beech Ridge Road, not far from the intersection with Gorham Road in North Scarborough. There were a grove of trees that were surrounding the cemetery, which offered it some protection, probably more so before the development came in. View of the cemetery through the trees back then. Gravestone monument for Captain John Larrabee, his wife, and their daughter. Gravestone of Lucy M., who was the wife of William D. Libby. This is the latest dated stone that I found in a private cemetery, 1926. This site has been recently cleaned and restored by an Eagle Scout, Luke Thatcher. I do have a copy of the article from the Forecaster up on the table as well, so you can get an idea as to what this looks like now. We did a really nice job cleaning that up and setting some of the stones and finding information on some of those that are buried in there. Another Libby Cemetery. This one is on Manson Road, on the right side overlooking the marsh. This is Samuel and Ellen Stone. And these stones have been hidden and protected for years by vegetation growth. You never know it was there unless you knew. And there's a close of Samuel's, who died in 1854. This is the Matthias Libby Family Cemetery. This is off of New Road, on the right coming from Gorham Road. When I went, it was down a drive behind an old farmhouse. These are the gravestones of Edward, Esther, and Matthias Libby. There's a close-up of Matthias Libby's gravestone, died in 1807. McKinney Cemetery. This cemetery is adjacent to the Matthias Cemetery on New Road. Matthias Libby Homestead became the property of Randolph McKinney. So you just put the cemeteries back to back. This stone reads, children of R.C. and S.L. McKinney, Hannah L., Edna F., Carrie L., and Josephine B. They all died under the age of 21. So since these photos were taken in '92, I know I've seen in the paper, recently new houses are going in this area. So I'm hoping that the cemeteries have been protected. This was the Joss Cemeteries on the Broad Turn Road, on the left just after the Joss Hill Estates and what was the Fuller Farm. This is the gravestone of Captain Jonathan Joseph Joss. All the gravestones were laid down in the middle of what was a cornfield. I got the impression that the cemetery was taking up a space that they could use to plant more crops. Memorial Cemetery on Blue Point. This was a photo of the overview of some of the white marble stones for the Seavey family that were moved from their original site on Blue Point Road to the cemetery. This was once a Moulton cemetery. This is on County Road to the left of a house under the lilac bushes and the remains of a crypt. Dorothy Shaw Libby said that this was Moulton, and she said it was found beside the road down from Ralph Deering's farm. And inside the crypt, it's now used as storage. So I don't know where Mr. Moulton is. Hope he was moved first. This is the King Family Cemetery. This is off of Broad Turn Road, down Susan Avenue. It's on the right, and the steps leading up to the hill. And the stone and plaque. This is in memory of Richard King and his sons Cyrus, Rufus, and William. Cyrus is buried in Laurel Hill, Saco. Rufus is buried in Grace Churchyard, Jamaica, Long Island, New York. And William, who was the first governor of Maine, is buried in Maple Grove Cemetery in Bath. All right, myth or truth? There are two trees that are supposed to be the burial place of a mother and daughter who died of smallpox and were quietly buried here, and the trees planted as for their gravestones, kind of. This information was related to me in 1988 by Tony and Irene Makowski. This is located on their property on Beach Ridge Road. Before it was Anthony and Irene's place, it belonged to Irene's parents, so it was the old Brile place. And it now belongs to Koski's grandson, Joe Duty. Colonel Westbrook Cemetery, behind Hillside Lumber on Route 22, near Smiling Hill Farm. This was rededicated in 1976. I believe it was part of the National Bicentennial Project that they did. And this was after years of secrecy as to where the location was of the cemetery. This is the Tibbetts and Honeywell Cemetery. It's on the Pleasant Hill Road, on the left beyond Rigby Road. It was located behind what was once Kennedy's Produce, and before that it was considered the old McDermott property. This is the gravestone for Charles Honeywell and his wife Dorothy. Dorothy has two stones. She's on this one, and she also has another after she married John Tibbetts. Different types of gravestones. This is in Dunstan, a gravestone for James Levitt, who died in 1876, Abigail, who died in 1877, and their daughter Amanda, who died in 1890. This is a metal monument. It's in the shape of an obelisk. It's cast from an alloy of zinc, copper, and tin. The attached panels that contain the names of the deceased could be unscrewed, and oftentimes during Prohibition, they became a perfect place to hide liquor. And these monuments, to me, they look like light-colored slate, and if you're not sure, you gotta wait until you tap on it to find out it's actually metal. This is back to Libby Jones' buggy and so forth off of Mussey Road. Here's a granite marker. for James Johnson, 1835 to 1907. Gravestones were once ordered from catalogs. This, I think, might be from a Sears catalog. Dunstan Cemetery, gravestone of Marion Josephine Foregrave, 1908 to 1950. This one has a ceramic memorial photo plaque attached to her gravestone. Some cemeteries got to be cleaned. This is yet another Libby cemetery. This is the gravestones of Samuel and Abigail, and this is the area that was before it was cleared of trees for the construction of Higas Parkway. He died in 1854 and she died in 1856. Samuel served in the Revolutionary War. This is what it looked like after the parkway was constructed. And after the gravesite was cleaned and flowers were planted by a group of Scarborough Historical Society volunteers in 1995, we planted some flowers, we put the flag up just before Memorial Day. This is Dolly Cemetery. This is behind 114 Ash Swamp Road. It's the gravestones of William and Abigail Dolly, who died in 1875, 2 months apart. In the background are the grave sites of their sons, Enos and Moses, and both those sons were Civil War veterans. And it's a close-up of the gravestone of Enos's, who died in 1879. This is a Joss Cemetery. This retaining wall was built for the cemetery at Joss Hill Estates off Broad Turn Road. The developer placed the retaining wall after a January thaw, pulled down part of the hill, and most likely the bone from Nathaniel Joss. It stopped construction, and medical examiner had to come in, and he examined the bone, and I think there was also a nail that came down, probably from that coffin, and it was confirmed that it was very old, and from that Joss Cemetery that's at the top of the hill. The gravestone of Zoa. She was the daughter of Nathaniel and Priscilla. She died in 1840 at the age of 21. Stone is leaning against a tree, and this photo was taken before the cemetery was cleaned. And that's what it looked like after. This was cleaned by an 8th grade Quest class. Ooh, what happened? Okay. Back to the Fenderson, Fickett, Harmon, Joe, Sands, Missouri. This is a gravestone of Mary Ann, wife of Nathaniel. She died in 1849 at the age of 45. And again, this is before it was cleaned. And after. This was cleaned by a Quest class in 1995. The students were excited because they found out after they cleaned it, they uncovered more stones that we didn't know about that had been buried all those years under forest litter. This is the Tibbetts Honeywell Cemetery of Mrs. Honeywell. They had 2 cemetery stones on Pleasant Hill. This was the cemetery before it was cleaned and after it was cleaned by an Eagle Scout. Now you can see the concrete posts from an old fence. This is the Moulton Thomas Cemetery that was off of Broad Turn. It's past Hanson Road, just on the right beyond the Fog Brook. In 1988, when I first visited, there were burned remains of the house, and there was a cellar hole that was visible. The cemetery was on a high rise in the field with a large pine standing in the middle and an iron fencing around it. And 3 years later, after a school class came and cleaned it. This is the Reverend Waterhouse Fogg Cemetery on Pearson's. This is before it was cleaned. The cemetery is in that tree line that slightly juts out into the field. After it was cleaned, and I guess everything mowed at the same time. But now you can see the cemetery. You kind of see the stones in that fencing. And it was much easier to see some of the gravestones in there, like Roseanne and Alpheus Fogg. Inside somewhere is the McLaughlin Cemetery. It's on Beach Ridge Road, almost diagonally across from Dresser Road. It was on Thames property. This is a view of the overground cemetery before one of its cleanings. There's a view after its first cleaning. And the cemetery is in the process of being cleaned by the Scarborough Historical volunteers back in '95. Sadly, some of those members are no longer with us. And there's a different view after the cemetery was cleaned and flowers planted. This is that Libby Cemetery off of Maple Avenue. This is Parker Osgood Libby Cemetery, and this is before a development was built in this area in 1989. An Eagle Scout by the name of James Cashmere cleaned it and erected a picket fence. But dirt bikers eroded the area, and the gravestone had been used for target practice. The site became a center of attention when the developer of this area found the site to be a thorn in his side. After a few calls of town officials, the area was filled in and graded around the eroding cemetery. The cleaning volunteers planted flowers and placed flags on it in '95 as part of Cleanup Sunday, just before Memorial Day. Gravestone of Parker Libby and the members of that particular Libby family. And the cemetery after the flowers and fence decorated. This is an example of a sign used to designate historical cemeteries, which in this particular cemetery is in Harrisburg, Rhode Island. It's where my grandparents and great-grandparents are buried. But I'm thinking perhaps we could come up with some kind of signs like this to mark the Scarborough cemeteries and just to bring awareness to the public that they are of a historical importance, not to be used for target practice and so forth. A few of the cemeteries on the outskirts. This one is in Westbrook. It's the Knight Cemetery on Route 22 near Hillside Lumber, Smiling Hill. When I went in, I counted 28 gravestones in this. Many of them are lying down. One of the stones was for Mary J., wife of Elbridge Libby. This is from the Libby Skillen Cemetery. Now this is in South Portland on the Running Hill Road. When I went to check this place out, this cemetery was completely hidden and protected under lilac trees. But now it's in plain view near the entrance to the main crossing mall that contains Applebee's and Target. This is the gravestone of Catherine. She was the wife of Johnson Libby, who died in 1853 at the age of 20. This one is from Saco. This is the Libby Cemetery on Watson Mill Road. It's found on under a large tree on a knoll across the street from a large colonial house that once belonged to Zebulon Libby. And here's his gravestone and his wife Lydia's. He served 3 years in the Revolutionary War. This is the Fenderson Marshall Cemetery. It's on Ash Swamp Road. It's gravestones of Liberty Fenderson and Olive, wife of Nathan Marshall. Now, when I took pictures for cemeteries, I took two, one for my notebook and one for the Historical Society. So this is the first picture I took of that, those two stones for one of the notebooks. And that's the site, the picture I got from the second one. Same exact location, within seconds, and now it has a little white spot over Liberty's footstone. Maybe it's her spirit. And this happened to be taken in July of '91. I say that because 3 years later, I took another picture with a different camera. And this is from Scarborough Beach near the Masker Pond in the Great Grave. I was doing a paper on Richard Honeywell, and I happened to take a picture, and when I had developed, saw that. And there is a book out on Maine's ghosts that include a story about lifeguard at Scarborough Beach that said he saw and heard something. So maybe it was Richard Honeywell taking a walk on the beach. And the next one is not a Scarborough Cemetery gravestone, but from Dennis, Mass. And this is what happens sometimes when you put two families together and share one gravestone. Yeah. Any questions? Yep.
Aren't there any rules to protect these family plots when development comes in?
Supposedly, I think rules are more lax before, and I think there's more of an awareness. After I had documented all these, I did bring it was more of a rough draft of that map to the planning board to let them know that there are grave sites in that area. And since then, like I said, they have the GPS now set up, so I know there's a new development going in off of the Higgins Parkway, where those two Libby stones have been hiding for all those years before, and they were aware that there is a historical cemetery there. So, but you know, there was talks that developers, you know, they're in their way. They just laid down stones and they just covered up and said nothing. I believe there's a cemetery stone at the corner of Holmes and Broadturn. There's one stone, but when the road was widened, I think the rest of the cemetery is underneath. So, you know, if it's out of sight, out of mind, you don't know what's there. So, it would be nice to have markers, but I don't know who's responsible for it. I was told through MOCA that if there's a veteran in it, that the town should take care of it. You go to the town, and the town says the Historical Society can take care of it. So.
The Historical Society has a book of some fascinating epitaphs, quite a little important. There's some cute ones in it, one of which says, "Here lies F.E. Brown, for whom life held few terrors. Born a maid, died a maid. No runs, no hits, no errors."
That's good. Yep.
Were you made aware of some of the cemeteries more in one section of town than the other?
There were a lot more on the interior side of the turnpike. Closer to town, I think a lot of people use the town cemetery. It was easy to get to those cemeteries to bury them. When you got to the interior, I don't think the roads were probably that great back then. It was just much easier to find a nice high knoll, you know. I was told high knoll because it was easy to dig, probably less likely to hit stone and so forth. And they just picked a nice picturesque place to put their loved ones.
During your talk, you said something about the fashions in England. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? Did the community here follow fashions in England closely, or?
I think they did until, when did we start rebelling against the English? But it was around that point they decided they did not want to follow England anymore. And that's when they started looking toward the willow, because now we're in France and we're looking to see what the Europeans were doing. Or I think at that time they found the remains of Pompeii, Herculaneum and all that. And I think that they started turning the tide toward that. They wanted nothing more to do with the English after that point. But before that, you know, they kind of relied on what the English did. Let's do the same thing, let's have the same kind of tombstones, gravestones, put the same kind of icons on it. No. Yep.
Yeah, on some of these old stones, I noticed I saw them in the photos. It shows the age they were at the time they died, and it says AE. Does that stand for age?
Yes.
Ended?
Yeah. They used a lot of Latin when they put the stone on the epitaphs and so forth. I think AE is, I don't know if there's a certain wording from probably age of or something in Latin or something. Yeah. Yeah. And some of the old stones you also see the long, that looks like an F. It's really that long S. So. Yep.
Well, I noticed that you mentioned the house on the side of the road. And if you were a long time ago, you would know that that road used to be close to that house. You can skid on it as you go by.
Really?
And you didn't know that was Longfellow's basis for his story of the house beside the road.
Oh, really?
So see, there's something to that.
I'll have to pull that out and read that now, too.
I'd like to tell you a little anecdote about Jan and I together out when she was documenting cemeteries. First of all, I'd like to say I was so impressed with the professional job that she did. She would have her graph paper, camera, yardstick, whatever, and everything was very professionally done. And I think I met Jan around 1994 at the Historical Society. So I started tagging along. And I remember I went with her to do one on the East Mountain Hill Farm. There was one on the Buckturn Road. And then we ended up, and we ended up on the Hearn Road one day, one of them, at the old Hearn farm of John Hearn. And I had a little Jack Russell Terrier, Ezekiel, that used to tag along with us. So we traipsed out into what had once been fields, I suspect, but it was well wooded. And we found the cemetery with beautiful wrought iron chain around it. It was had a little fence around it. Well, as Jan and I are working, and I'm helping however I can, we noticed that foxes had sort of invaded that cemetery, and there were a lot of foxholes. Well, my dog discovered the foxholes, and all of a sudden we look, and there's Ezekiel with a human bone that he had brought up in one of the holes. And we thought, oh my gosh, what do we do now? So Jan said, well, we're going to send it back where it came from. But needless to say, the dog did not come with us anymore.
Thank you very much.